in fairy tales, there's the youngest sister is often the hero, is often the protagonist, and I'm curious why you wound up choosing the youngest sister for your point of view character. It's such a classic fairy tale thing.
Yeah, you're so right. I didn't even really think about it that way. I am the eldest actually of three girls, which is why I wanted to write about sisters and this kind of, intoxicating, intense bond that you have with these people who you grow up with. And I didn't want to write it from the perspective of the eldest because I felt like she would be a very protective character, the way I am of my younger sisters. And I kind of think my youngest sister has like big protagonist energy. And so I was really just inspired by her. She's great. I'm obsessed with her. And I think I wanted to almost write something from her perspective and explore the way that she maybe feels about my other sister and me, and kind of jump into her head a little bit. Honestly, she inspired my second book. She inspired this book. She's great, big protagonist energy. And so it was kind of accidental. And also the three girls element, I realize now, is also such a fairy tale trope. And we're so used to seeing the number three, like three wishes, three sisters, that kind of thing. But that too was a little bit accidental because I really just wanted to draw on my own experience of being one of three. But it ended up fitting so nicely into the story.
So I cannot remember who said this, but I quote it all the time, so I feel really bad about it. But one time I was on a panel at a science fiction convention, and there was someone who's talking about the difference between dark fantasy and horror. And they said that the difference was that in dark fantasy, like in horror, there is a sense of wrongness to the magic, that there's a sense of sort of corruption. And that in horror, and in dark, that was horror. And in dark fantasy, there's a sense of awe, that even if the world is about to, even if whatever is out there is out to, going to destroy you, you still have that sense of magic and awe, and like maybe you even want it in the world because of that sense of awe. And I was curious, first of all, if you thought there was a need for any division between dark fantasy and horror, and if you conceptualized this along the lines of horror, or if you thought, no, this is fantasy.
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, I didn't think I was writing a horror book when I started writing it. Like, I just knew that I wanted to kind of have this contemporary world where the supernatural brushes up very gently against our world. That's my jam. I really like that. And then kind of the further I delved into the story, I guess the more kind of horrific things began happening to these characters, and I just kind of went along with it. And then I was a little surprised and maybe a little bit hesitant at the beginning of our kind of marketing campaign when we were talking about this book as a horror book, and it didn't. Almost, I was like, I had a reaction to it in the beginning, like, oh, I don't think it's a horror book. It is kind of like a dark fantasy, which is weird because for me there is a distinction, like you said. They do feel like slightly different things, and I think this one very much kind of like is on the borderline between the two. But then I look at some of the stories that I was inspired by while I was writing, and Annihilation was a really big one, the Natalie Portman movie, and then Midsummer as well, the amazing horror movie that takes place in Sweden in broad daylight, and there's just flowers everywhere. So I think this was my attempt to write something that was horror, but not in the way that we might be used to thinking about horror, where it's kind of, dark and there's a serial killer and it's gory. I wanted to do the Midsummer thing where it was visually so beautiful, but there was this sense of corruption and wrongness underneath everything. So if you're talking about it in those terms, I think I accidentally wrote a horror book, but I'm happy with how it turned out in the end.
Well, I mean, it definitely has horror elements, right? And I'm not sure where it sits. I probably do think of it as hard dark fantasy because I do
Yeah.
have that sense of awe. I do
Yeah.
want that world to be there. And
Oh,
I do
love
have
that.
that sense of like, this is magic. Like I want magic.
Yeah.
Um, but obviously, there are these horror elements. And one, I think, is actually in the language itself, right? There's this juxtaposition of the foul and the gorgeous that goes, throughout the book and is very folkloric. It's very compelling. I find it like intensely attractive, and it like kept me in this sort of sensual space of it. And I'm curious, what is the purpose of that kind of juxtaposition?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll come back to the midsummer thing here again and say, I was so in awe when I watched this movie that they were able to have something that was so visually beautiful, but felt eerie the entire way through. And Annihilation as well is exactly the same. So Annihilation, I would consider probably a horror movie too, where it's these group of women who they go in and explore this kind of strange anomaly that's happening where all of the trees and animals and everything that exists in this small area is kind of mutating and becoming different. And that too is like there are flowers growing out of animals' backs and out of corpses. And these two things kind of came together, these two kind of pop culture references came together at one time while I was putting all this like soup together. And I wanted to try and capture some of that because, I don't know, I'm not used to seeing gore pressed up against beauty in such an obvious way. And then of course there's something really, I don't know, attractive or exciting as a writer to try and describe ugly things in beautiful language, to make it almost delicious in a way. So it was a fun challenge, and I really luxuriated in the language of this book and spending time describing these smells and the way things looked. I would describe the language as luxurious, and I had so much fun just thinking of all these kind of gross, beautiful things that happened to these poor girls.
So we've been talking about it in so much in this one particular way, but I also want to say that it's really funny.
Yeah.
That there are places where it's very romantic. And I'm curious how you approach a story that has so much in terms of language, because that stuff is all language stuff too. A funny line that undercuts horror is about precision and it's about timing. And I'm curious how much work you do. Like, does it come out? Is the language stuff just part of how you write? Is it something you come back and mess with again and again? Like, how much, when you're sitting down to write the story, is your internal editor sort of aware and sort of steering you?
Yeah, I'd love to hear your answer to this too, actually, after I tell you my process. But I'm a really slow drafter, so I like it just like to sit with my page and think about each sentence as I go along and think about like what the character is seeing or smelling, and then I look up different ways of saying what they're seeing or smelling. And I had this kind of master document on my iPad while I was writing, where I kept these kind of word clouds of kind of atmospheric things that I was trying to capture while I was writing. So I think one of them was smoke, and one of them was earth, and one of them was greenery, one of them was perfume, one of them was rot and infection and things like that. And then I just had all of these different words and ideas kind of sprouting off from these main themes that I wanted to capture in the atmosphere. And I would come back to this document quite frequently, actually, not every day, but whenever I felt like I was losing my way with, sometimes the words just don't come to you. I would go back to this document and reference what I was trying to capture, which I hadn't done that before. I think this is my most kind of atmospheric book so far. And so the language was really inbuilt from the beginning, which is probably why it took me so long to write this damn book, because I just really took my time. But I loved it. I loved writing slowly and thinking about everything and just kind of, yeah, savoring every sentence.